17 women, one man. Those weren't dating app odds. That was reality for our ancestors after the most brutal conflict in human history. Scientists just discovered why this prehistoric war was so savage it nearly ended our species before civilization even began. Something strange happened to men about 7,000 years ago. Not just a few men in one place, men everywhere. Scientists discovered this mystery buried deep inside our DNA, and what they found doesn't make sense at first glance. Around 5000 BCE, for every single man who managed to pass on his genes to future generations, 17 women did the same thing. 17 to 1. That's not a typo. Your male ancestors from that time period, most of them hit a genetic dead end. Their bloodlines just stopped. Meanwhile, women's genetic lines kept flowing like normal rivers, completely unaffected by whatever catastrophe wiped out their male counterparts. The evidence comes from studying Y chromosomes, which fathers pass directly to their sons. Think of Y chromosomes as genetic surnames that never change much as they move from father to son to grandson. When geneticists mapped these chromosomes across modern populations, they expected to see gradual changes over thousands of years. Instead, they found something that looked like a genetic massacre. Between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, Y chromosome diversity crashed harder than the stock market in 1929. The variety that had built up over tens of thousands of years of human evolution suddenly collapsed into just a handful of surviving lineages. Most men's genetic signatures simply vanished from the human story. But here's where it gets really weird. This wasn't a local disaster that hit one unlucky tribe or region. The genetic collapse happened simultaneously across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Different continents, different climates, different cultures, yet the same devastating pattern shows up everywhere scientists look. What could possibly cause such widespread destruction of male genetic lines while leaving women completely untouched? Scientists initially wondered if some terrible plague had swept across the world, targeting men specifically. Maybe a disease that killed boys before they could father children. Or perhaps some climate catastrophe that somehow affected the sexes differently. These theories crumbled under scrutiny because natural disasters don't discriminate based on chromosomes. The pattern was too precise, too targeted. Something was systematically eliminating most men's ability to reproduce while women continued having children at normal rates. The math alone should make your head spin. If only one man reproduced for every 17 women, either polygamy was running wild or something was killing off male genetic lines faster than a medieval plague. Researchers dubbed this bizarre event the Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck, which sounds academic enough to hide how absolutely bonkers the whole thing really is. The Neolithic period was when humans were transitioning from hunting and gathering to farming and settling down in permanent communities. Supposedly a more peaceful time when people learned to grow crops and domesticate animals. Yet the genetic evidence suggests this era was anything but peaceful for men. The bottleneck wasn't a quick event either. It stretched across roughly 2,000 years, meaning multiple generations of men faced whatever force was eliminating their bloodlines. This wasn't a single catastrophic war or one terrible decade. It was centuries of systematic genetic elimination. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is how recently scientists figured it out. For decades, researchers focused on mitochondrial DNA, which mothers pass to all their children. That DNA told a story of steady population growth and normal genetic diversity. Nobody thought to look closely at Y chromosomes until better technology made it possible to sequence them accurately. When they finally did, the results were so shocking that some scientists initially thought their data was wrong. The genetic detective work revealed something unprecedented in human history. Other species occasionally experience population bottlenecks when environmental disasters or predators nearly wipe them out. But those bottlenecks affect both males and females equally. This was different. This was selective. Modern men walking around today mostly descend from just a tiny fraction of the men who lived during the Neolithic period. Your male ancestors were either incredibly lucky, incredibly powerful, or both. The vast majority of their contemporaries left no genetic trace in the modern world. Women, meanwhile, show no such bottleneck in their genetic history. Their mitochondrial DNA reveals steady diversity throughout the same time period when Y chromosomes were crashing. They were clearly surviving and reproducing normally, while something was systematically eliminating male genetic lines. The implications are staggering. If this pattern is accurate, then nearly 90% of men from that era failed to pass on their genes to future generations. Their family lines ended forever. But what could cause such a dramatic and sex-specific genetic collapse across multiple continents over thousands of years? The answer lies hidden in the ancient DNA itself, waiting to tell us a story about our ancestors that's far more violent and complex than anyone expected. The genetic mystery deepened when scientists started comparing two very different types of DNA. Y chromosomes come from fathers and pass down through male lines generation after generation. Mitochondrial DNA comes from mothers and travels through female bloodlines. What researchers found was absolutely mind-blowing. Over roughly 2,000 years, Y chromosome diversity nearly vanished. We're talking about a collapse so dramatic that it left scientists staring at their data in disbelief. But here's the kicker. Mitochondrial DNA from mothers stayed incredibly rich and diverse throughout this exact same period. The contrast was so sharp, it looked like someone had taken an eraser to half the genetic code while leaving the other half completely untouched. This pattern screamed that only a handful of men were fathering children while tons of women continued having babies. Makes sense, right? Well, not really. Population crashes usually hit everyone equally. Diseases don't pick favorites based on gender. Natural disasters wipe out entire communities without caring about chromosomes. Yet here was evidence of something that specifically targeted men's genetic lines while women's flourished. The numbers were staggering. For every man who successfully passed on his genes, 17 women did the same. That's not a typo, 17 to 1. Think about your high school class. If this ratio applied today, maybe 2 guys would become fathers while nearly every girl would become a mother. The genetic bottleneck wasn't just unusual, it was unlike anything scientists had ever documented in human history. But wait, there's more weirdness. This wasn't some local phenomenon affecting one unlucky tribe or region. The DNA evidence showed this pattern occurring simultaneously across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Different continents, different climates, different cultures, yet all experiencing the same bizarre genetic collapse at roughly the same time. What could possibly cause such a coordinated disaster across the ancient world? Traditional explanations crumbled under scrutiny. A massive plague might reduce population sizes, but diseases typically kill men and women in similar proportions. Climate change could force migrations or cause famines, but again, both sexes would suffer equally. Wars might kill more men than women, but ancient conflicts were usually small-scale affairs between neighboring groups, nothing capable of creating a global genetic bottleneck lasting millennia. The DNA trail revealed something far more complex and disturbing. Most men's genetic lines didn't just decline gradually over time. They ended abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned off their reproductive futures forever. These weren't natural deaths from old age or disease. The genetic signatures suggested sudden violent interruptions that prevented entire male bloodlines from continuing. Meanwhile, women's mitochondrial DNA told a completely different story. Their genetic diversity remained stable, even increasing in some regions. This meant women weren't just surviving whatever was happening to men, they were thriving reproductively. The sharp contrast between collapsing male lines and flourishing female lines pointed to something unprecedented in human evolution. Geneticists ran computer models trying to explain this paradox. Random genetic drift couldn't account for such extreme patterns. Population bottlenecks from environmental disasters failed to match the sex-specific nature of the collapse. Even accounting for prehistoric migration patterns and cultural practices, nothing quite fit the evidence emerging from ancient DNA samples. Then, researchers noticed something crucial about the timing. The Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck coincided with major shifts in human society. This was when farming communities were expanding, populations were growing, and people were settling into permanent villages. Social structures were becoming more complex, and competition for resources was intensifying. The genetic collapse wasn't happening in isolation, it was occurring during one of humanity's most transformative periods. The mystery deepened when scientists examined specific regions more closely. In some areas, single Y chromosome lineages dominated entire populations, suggesting that one male bloodline had somehow replaced dozens of others. These weren't gradual genetic changes occurring over many generations. The DNA evidence pointed to rapid, dramatic shifts where most male lines simply vanished while a few exploded in frequency. Archaeological evidence began supporting the genetic findings. Ancient burial sites from this period showed signs of increased violence, mass graves, and fortified settlements. Weapons became more sophisticated and common. Art and artifacts depicted warfare and conflict with growing frequency. The physical evidence was lining up with the genetic mystery in unsettling ways. Yet the biggest puzzle remained unsolved. What mechanism could specifically target male genetic lines while preserving female ones? What force could operate across multiple continents simultaneously, creating identical patterns in genetically distinct populations? The answer would require looking beyond biology into the social structures and cultural practices of Neolithic societies. The clues were scattered across ancient DNA samples, burial sites, and settlement patterns. Scientists were beginning to piece together a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about early human civilization. The genetic evidence was pointing towards something far more organized and systematic than random violence or natural disasters. Understanding what really happened during those crucial millennia would require examining how ancient people actually lived, thought, and organized their societies. Life around 7,000 years ago wasn't exactly what you'd call comfortable. Most people lived in tiny farming villages scattered across the landscape, each housing maybe 50 to 100 people at most. These weren't sprawling cities or even decent-sized towns. We're talking about clusters of mud brick houses, wooden huts, and stone shelters that probably smelled like a combination of livestock, smoke, and unwashed humans. The weird part is how these communities actually functioned. Everyone knew everyone else's business, obviously, but more importantly, these villages operated like mini-kingdoms ruled by family clans. Each clan traced their bloodline back through the male side: fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and so on. Your dad's family name? That determined pretty much everything about your life. These early farmers had figured out how to grow crops, sure, but they were still using stone tools for almost everything. No metal plows, no iron axes, no bronze weapons yet, just carefully crafted stone blades, wooden handles, and a whole lot of muscle power. Makes sense, right? The Bronze Age was still a few centuries away, so people made do with what nature provided. Then there's the whole territory situation. Each village controlled a specific chunk of land around their settlement. This wasn't just about having space to live, it was about survival. The fertile fields, the fresh water sources, the hunting grounds, the places where useful stones could be found. All of it belonged to the clan that got there first and could defend it from everyone else. Well, defending territory became a full-time obsession. Other villages were always looking to expand, especially when their own crops failed or their population grew too large. Food shortages meant raiding season. Bad harvests meant your neighbors might decide your land looked pretty appealing. The result? Constant low-level tension between communities, punctuated by actual violence. But here's where things get really interesting from a genetic perspective. Women in these societies had a completely different role than men when it came to clan membership. While men stayed put with their fathers' families their entire lives, women typically moved between villages when they got married. A girl born in Village A might marry a guy from Village B and spend the rest of her life there. This wasn't just some romantic tradition. It was strategic. Villages needed to avoid inbreeding, and they also used marriages to form alliances. Your daughter marrying into another clan meant potential backup during conflicts. Maybe. Or it meant nothing when push came to shove, which happened more often than anyone liked to admit. The social structure was pretty rigid, too. Most clans had a clear hierarchy based on male lineage. The eldest son of the most important family usually called the shots. Everyone else fell in line below him. His brothers, his cousins, their sons, and so on down the family tree. Regular clan members had some say in decisions, but the big choices about war, territory, and resources, that was handled by a very small group of powerful men. Let's not forget how brutal daily life could be. These weren't peaceful farming communes where everyone shared resources and sang songs around the fire. Archaeological evidence shows these early agricultural societies were surprisingly violent. Mass graves filled with bodies bearing weapon wounds, fortified villages with defensive walls and watchtowers, tools that doubled as weapons. And the weird part is how quickly conflicts could escalate. A dispute over water rights or grazing land could turn into a multi-generational blood feud between entire clans. One village might raid another for livestock, leading to retaliation raids, which led to bigger conflicts, which eventually pulled in allied clans from other regions. The winning clans in these conflicts didn't just take territory and resources, they often absorbed the surviving members of defeated villages, especially the women and children. Dead men meant empty genetic lineages, but surviving women could be integrated into the victorious clan's families. Their children would carry the winning clan's male bloodline forward. Trading did happen between villages, but it was always tense. Meeting strangers meant potential opportunity, sure, but it also meant potential danger. Were these traders? Raiders scouting for future attacks? Representatives looking to form alliances? You never really knew until weapons either came out or stayed hidden. This constant state of competition and conflict created something like a genetic pressure cooker. Clans that couldn't defend themselves effectively got wiped out or absorbed. Their male lineages vanished from the gene pool forever. Meanwhile, the most successful warrior clans grew larger and more powerful with each victory. The stage was perfectly set for something unprecedented in human history. All the pieces were in place: patrilineal clan structures, constant warfare, women moving between groups, and most importantly, the winner-takes-all mentality that would soon reshape the entire human gene pool. What happened next would make these village conflicts look like minor disagreements. The secret to understanding this massive genetic collapse lies in how these ancient societies were organized. And boy, were they organized in a way that would make modern family drama look like child's play. Most Neolithic communities built their entire social structure around something called patrilineal clans. What's that mean? Well, everything important, your name, your land, your status, even your gods, came through your father's side of the family. Your dad's bloodline was your ticket to everything that mattered in life. Here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just loose family connections like we might have today. We're talking about rigid, ironclad systems where your great-great-great-grandfather's identity still determined whether you lived in a mud hut or a fancy stone house. The clan wasn't just your family, it was your army, your government, and your insurance policy all rolled into one. But here's the kicker. Since everything flowed through male bloodlines, every clan essentially became a walking advertisement for one particular set of Y chromosomes. Each group was literally a genetic team, all carrying the same paternal DNA signature. Makes sense, right? Now imagine dozens of these clans scattered across the landscape, each one fiercely protective of their territory, their resources, and most importantly, their reputation. Competition wasn't just healthy rivalry, it was a matter of survival. Land meant food. Food meant life. And wives? Well, wives meant the next generation would carry on your precious family line. The structure created something anthropologists love to call fraternal interest groups. Fancy term for bands of related guys who stick together no matter what. Brothers, cousins, uncles, all united by their shared male ancestor and all deeply invested in making sure their particular Y chromosome made it to the next generation. But wait, there's more to this genetic popularity contest. Within each clan, power wasn't distributed equally among the men. Not even close. You had a handful of elite males at the top, the clan leaders, the warriors, the guys with the best land and the most wives. Then, you had everyone else. Most men in these societies had about as much power as a soggy piece of bread. They followed orders, worked the fields, and hoped maybe someday they'd get lucky enough to start a family. The hierarchy was brutal, and climbing it required either exceptional skill, incredible luck, or being born to the right father. Think about what this meant for reproduction. If only the top-tier men in each clan got to have multiple wives and lots of children, then even within a successful clan, most male genetic lines were already on thin ice. Add in the constant threat from neighboring clans, and you've got a recipe for genetic disaster. The competition between clans was absolutely ruthless. Land disputes could turn deadly in a heartbeat. Cattle raids became full-scale wars. Even something as simple as a marriage negotiation gone wrong could spark generations of blood feuds. These weren't sophisticated armies with rules of engagement. These were desperate groups of farmers with stone axes and a lot of pent-up aggression. And the weird part is, losing wasn't just about pride or territory. When your entire social identity revolved around your patrilineal clan, defeat meant the potential extinction of everything your ancestors had built. Your family name, your bloodline, your genetic legacy, all of it could vanish in a single bad season of warfare. Archaeological evidence backs this up beautifully. Sites from this period are littered with mass graves, burned villages, and weapons designed specifically for human combat. Skull fractures from stone axes, arrow points embedded in rib cages. The violence was personal, intimate, and absolutely devastating. Then there's the geographic factor. These patrilineal societies had a nasty habit of keeping their men close to home while sending their women off to marry into other clans. Sounds reasonable for maintaining alliances, but it created a terrible vulnerability. When raiders came calling, they found all the men of fighting age clustered together in one convenient location. The mathematics of patrilineal warfare were simple and brutal. Defeat meant the immediate loss of most adult males in the clan. Without men to defend territory or maintain political alliances, the remaining survivors, mostly women, children, and elderly, faced impossible choices: submit to the victors, flee to distant relatives, or try to rebuild from nothing. But here's what makes this whole system particularly fascinating from a genetic perspective. The winners in these clan wars didn't just take territory, they took everything. Land, livestock, stored grain, and yes, women of reproductive age. The victorious clan's Y chromosomes suddenly had access to a much larger pool of potential mothers for the next generation. This wasn't happening in just one region or among one group of people. From the grasslands of Central Asia to the forests of Northern Europe, the same pattern was playing out. Patrilineal clans, territorial warfare, genetic winners and losers. What made certain bloodlines survive this chaos while others vanished completely? The answer lies in understanding exactly how these wars unfolded across generations. War wasn't a one-time event that suddenly wiped out most men's genetic lines. That's not how history works, and it's definitely not how genetics works either. The Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck happened over centuries of repeated conflicts, generation after generation of violence that slowly choked out male bloodlines like a tightening noose. Computer simulations reveal something fascinating about how these clan wars actually played out. When researchers modeled patrilineal societies fighting each other, they discovered that losing just one major conflict could doom an entire male lineage forever. But here's the kicker. It didn't happen overnight. These weren't apocalyptic battles that ended everything in a single afternoon. Instead, they were grinding, relentless cycles of warfare that stretched across multiple lifetimes. Picture how brutal this mathematics really was. A clan might have 50 men ready to fight. After losing a war, maybe only 10 survived. Those 10 might rebuild, have sons, and try again 20 years later. But then, another conflict erupts. Maybe this time only 3 men make it out alive. Their bloodline hangs by an increasingly thin thread. One more defeat, and that's it. Thousands of years of ancestry snuffed out completely. The archaeological evidence backs up this grim scenario perfectly. Mass graves from this period don't show single catastrophic events. Instead, they reveal layer upon layer of violence spread across centuries. Skulls cracked by stone axes, bodies buried hastily in shallow pits, fortified villages surrounded by defensive walls that got thicker and higher over time. Each generation seemed to expect the next war. Well, the timing of these conflicts wasn't random either. They coincided with major changes in how people lived. Farming communities were growing larger and more settled. Land became more valuable because crops needed specific territories. Unlike nomadic hunters who could just move when resources ran low, farmers had to stay and fight for their fields. This created a perfect storm for territorial warfare. But why did the violence target men so specifically? The answer lies in how these patrilineal clans actually functioned during wartime. When conflict broke out, men didn't have the luxury of neutrality. They fought for their father's clan, or they died trying. There was no switching sides, no diplomatic immunity, no conscientious objector status. Your Y chromosome determined which army you joined, and losing meant extinction for your entire male line. The victorious clans faced their own brutal mathematics too. They couldn't just ignore the defeated territories. Empty land was valuable land. Someone had to farm those fields, manage those herds, and defend those borders. The solution was both practical and devastating. Absorb the surviving population, but only the parts that didn't threaten your clan's power structure. Men from defeated clans posed obvious problems. They carried grudges, revenge fantasies, and competing claims to leadership. Why risk future rebellion when you could simply eliminate the problem entirely? Archaeological sites show evidence of systematic execution, not random killing, but deliberate targeting of adult males from conquered groups. Then there's the generational aspect that makes this whole scenario even more chilling. These wars didn't end conflicts. They created new ones. Sons of massacred fathers grew up hearing stories about their stolen inheritance. Grandsons planned revenge for battles they never witnessed. Each generation inherited both the trauma and the obligation to settle old scores. The cycle fed on itself like a genetic death spiral. Computer models suggest that even relatively small advantages in warfare could compound over time to create massive genetic bottlenecks. A clan that won 60% of its conflicts instead of 50% would eventually dominate entire regions. Meanwhile, clans that lost just slightly more often would see their male lines dwindle generation by generation until they vanished completely. The timing also explains why this pattern appeared simultaneously across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Neolithic agricultural revolution wasn't a local phenomenon. It was a global transformation that created similar pressures everywhere. As farming spread, it brought patrilineal clan structures with it, and wherever those social systems took root, the same deadly mathematics began playing out. Archaeological evidence shows that some regions experience more intense bottlenecks than others, suggesting that local factors mattered too. Areas with better natural defenses or more abundant resources might have seen less extreme genetic collapse, but nowhere completely escaped the pattern. Even the lucky regions lost substantial portions of their male genetic diversity. The sheer scale of this violence becomes clear when you consider the numbers. For every 17 women who successfully passed on their genes, only one man managed the same feat. That's not the result of a single war or even a single generation of conflict. That's the cumulative effect of centuries of systematic elimination of male bloodlines through organized violence. What makes this story even more remarkable is how these ancient wars set the stage for everything that came after. The handful of male lineages that survived this crucible would go on to shape entire civilizations. But that's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn. Wars have winners and losers. But in the Neolithic world, being on the winning side meant something far more dramatic than we might imagine today. The genetic evidence shows us that only a tiny fraction of male bloodlines made it through these brutal centuries. We're talking about survival rates that would make a lottery look generous. The numbers tell an incredible story. Out of hundreds, maybe thousands of competing male lineages in any given region, perhaps only one or two would emerge victorious. Think about that for a moment. Entire family trees getting chopped down, leaving just a few mighty oaks standing. These weren't just military victories. They were genetic conquests that would echo through millennia. Archaeological evidence backs up this winner-takes-all scenario. In some regions of Europe, researchers found that a single Y chromosome type became so dominant it's like one ancient father had thousands of descendants, while his competitors had none. The Yamnaya culture provides a perfect example of this phenomenon. These horse-riding warriors from the steppes didn't just conquer territory, they conquered the gene pool itself. But how exactly did this happen? Well, when one clan wiped out another, they weren't just taking land and cattle. They were eliminating entire genetic lineages in one brutal sweep. The defeated men died in battle or were executed afterward. Their sons shared the same fate. Their male cousins, uncles, and nephews, gone. Within a single generation, thousands of years of genetic heritage could vanish completely. The winning clans, however, hit the genetic jackpot. Suddenly, they controlled vast territories, abundant resources, and had access to many more women. This created what geneticists call a founder effect, where a small group becomes the ancestors of a much larger population. One successful warrior chief might father dozens of children with multiple wives and captives. His sons would do the same. Within a few generations, his Y chromosome would be everywhere. Let's not forget the sheer mathematical advantage this created. If the average defeated clan had maybe 50 men, and the victorious clan absorbed their territory and women, the genetic impact was massive. The winning males weren't just replacing the losers, they were expanding into entirely new reproductive opportunities. More land meant more food. More food meant the ability to support larger families. Larger families meant more genetic copies spreading across the landscape. Then, there's the snowball effect. Success bred more success. Clans with larger populations and better resources could launch bigger raids against their neighbors. They could afford better weapons, more warriors, and longer campaigns. The rich got richer, genetically speaking, while the poor got extinct. The DNA evidence shows this pattern played out differently in various regions, but the end result was remarkably similar. Whether we look at ancient Europe, Asia, or Africa, we see the same genetic signature, massive diversity, collapsing down to just a few male lineages. Some areas show even more extreme bottlenecks than others. In certain regions, it's as if one ancient man became the genetic Adam for thousands of future descendants. This wasn't a quick process, mind you. These genetic conquests unfolded over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Generation after generation of warfare slowly winnowed down the male lineages until only the most successful remained. Each conflict eliminated a few more family lines. Each victory consolidated genetic power into fewer hands. What makes this even more remarkable is how consistent the pattern was across different continents and cultures. From the steppes of Central Asia to the forests of Northern Europe, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the plains of Africa, everywhere we look, we see the same story. A few male genetic lineages rising to dominance while hundreds of others disappeared forever. The lucky few who survived this genetic gauntlet became the founding fathers of entire populations. Their DNA spread like wildfire through subsequent generations. Today, millions of people can trace their paternal ancestry back to these ancient genetic winners. Makes you wonder about your own family tree, doesn't it? But here's what's truly fascinating about this whole situation. While the men were busy eliminating each other's genetic futures, something completely different was happening with the women. The same brutal wars that destroyed male lineages actually preserved female genetic diversity in ways that seem almost impossible. The contrast couldn't be more striking, and understanding why reveals the final piece of this prehistoric puzzle. Picture a battlefield after the smoke clears, dead warriors scattered everywhere, their bloodlines ending right there in the dirt. But here's the thing that stumped scientists for years. The women from those same defeated clans didn't just vanish into history. Their genetic lines kept going strong, weaving through generations like an unbroken thread. While men's Y chromosomes were getting wiped out left and right, mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through mothers, stayed remarkably stable. We're talking about the same brutal period where 17 women passed on their genes for every one man. Yet somehow, almost all the women's genetic lines survived this prehistoric massacre. The answer lies in what happened after the fighting stopped. When one clan crushed another, they didn't just walk away victorious, they took everything: land, livestock, tools, and yes, the women. These weren't romantic fairy tales we're talking about. Conquering warriors would kill or drive off the defeated men, then integrate the women into their own families. Sometimes as wives, sometimes as captives, but either way, these women kept having children. Think about it from a practical standpoint. A victorious clan suddenly controls twice as much territory. They've got more resources than ever before. But they also need people to work the land, raise the kids, and keep the community going. Dead men can't help with that, but living women absolutely can. The genetics tell this story perfectly. When researchers traced mitochondrial DNA patterns, they found something fascinating. Women's genetic lines from losing clans kept appearing in the DNA of winning clans. The female genetic material got mixed right into the victor's gene pool, creating this incredible diversity that persists even today. But there's another crucial piece to this puzzle. Women in these ancient societies already moved between groups way more than men did. It was pretty standard practice for women to marry into different clans, while men typically stayed put with their birth families. And this created a natural mixing system that kept female genetic lines spread across wide areas. When clan wars erupted, this existing pattern got supercharged. A woman whose brothers and father died in battle might find herself absorbed into the conquering group, but her mitochondrial DNA, that genetic signature from her mother's line, came right along with her. Her children would carry forward her maternal genes, even if their father came from this victorious clan. The archaeological evidence backs this up in disturbing detail. Mass graves from this period show something telling. Lots of dead men, but far fewer dead women. Either women were buried separately, or more likely, they weren't killed in the same numbers. The victors had practical reasons to keep them alive. Let's not forget the simple math here. If you're a successful warrior clan that just wiped out your neighbors, you've suddenly got a gender imbalance problem. Your own men need wives, and dead enemies don't produce the next generation of workers and fighters. Taking in the surviving women solved multiple problems at once. This pattern played out differently than you might expect. It wasn't just about powerful men collecting harems, though that certainly happened. Even lower-ranking men in victorious clans might end up with wives whose fathers and brothers had been their enemies just months before. The woman's mitochondrial DNA would pass to her children regardless of who fathered them. The genetic mixing created something like a one-way valve. Male Y chromosomes got eliminated when their clans lost, but female mitochondrial DNA kept flowing through the population. A woman from a defeated group might become the mother of future warriors who would carry her maternal genes forward, even as they continued their father's clan traditions. And here's where it gets really interesting. This survival strategy meant that women's genetic diversity actually increased in some regions. As conquering clans absorbed women from multiple defeated groups, they were essentially collecting genetic material from across wide geographic areas. Each victorious clan became a melting pot of female genetic lines. The computer models that scientists use today show this pattern repeating over and over. Generation after generation of clan warfare created this incredible genetic filter. Male lines got cut off abruptly when they picked the wrong fight, but female lines kept weaving through the surviving population like rivers finding new paths to the sea. Regional variations make the picture even more complex. In some areas, genetic evidence suggests that women retained enough influence to shape which of their sons would carry on the family legacy. The surviving matriarchs might have played kingmaker roles that aren't immediately obvious from the archaeological record. This explains why modern genetic studies show such a stark contrast between male and female ancestry. Most of us can trace our maternal lines back through dozens of different ancient female ancestors, while our paternal lines often trace back to just a handful of ancient men. But this genetic survival story raises an even bigger question about what this dramatic reshuffling meant for ancient societies themselves. When genetic lines collapse this dramatically, society doesn't just lose DNA diversity. It transforms completely. The bottleneck created a world where power, resources, and reproductive success concentrated in the hands of incredibly few men. We're talking about a shift so extreme that it rewrote the rules of human civilization. Picture what happens when 16 out of every 17 male bloodlines vanish from existence. The surviving men weren't just lucky. They were the absolute elite. They controlled the best land, commanded the largest armies, and accumulated the most wealth. But here's where it gets really interesting. This concentration of power created a feedback loop that made inequality even more extreme. The math is brutal. If one powerful clan leader could support multiple wives, while dozens of other men couldn't even find one, the genetic advantage compounds generation after generation. These elite men weren't just having more children, they were having vastly more children. Some researchers estimate that successful clan leaders might have fathered 20, 30, or even 50 offspring. Meanwhile, most men had zero. Well, what does this do to society? It creates a massive pyramid with a tiny elite at the top and enormous numbers of excluded men at the bottom. These excluded men became warriors, servants, or workers for the powerful families. They had little choice. Join a winning clan's military force, hope for scraps of land or status, or face elimination entirely. Then there's the women's situation, which reveals another layer of this transformation. Successful clans didn't just hoard resources, they hoarded wives. Polygamy became not just acceptable, but necessary for the most powerful men. Archaeological evidence from this period shows elaborate burial sites where one man is surrounded by multiple women, suggesting these marriage patterns were deeply embedded in the social structure. But the ripple effects went far beyond individual families. Entire communities reorganized around serving these genetic winners. Villages that once operated as relatively equal groups of farmers became stratified societies with clear rulers and subjects. The clan leaders needed administrators, craftsmen, and soldiers to maintain their dominance. Makes sense, right? You can't run a mini empire with just your immediate family. Archaeological sites from this period tell the story perfectly. We see the emergence of monumental architecture, stone circles, burial mounds, and fortified settlements that required massive coordination and labor. These weren't community projects where everyone benefited equally. They were displays of power by the genetic survivors built by the labor of men who would never pass on their own genes. Let's not forget the cultural implications. The oral traditions and early written records from various cultures all echo this same pattern. Stories of great kings with many wives, epic battles between royal houses, and the divine right of certain bloodlines to rule. These weren't just myths, they were cultural memories of this genetic bottleneck period. And the weird part is how this created its own stability. Once a few male lines dominated, they had enormous incentives to maintain that system. They developed elaborate rules about inheritance, marriage alliances, and social hierarchy. Breaking these rules meant risking everything their ancestors had won through generations of warfare. The genetic data shows us something else fascinating. Regions where the bottleneck was most severe often developed the most rigid social structures. Areas of Europe and Asia where Y chromosome diversity nearly vanished completely correspond with archaeological evidence of highly stratified societies, monumental architecture, and complex burial practices indicating extreme social inequality. This wasn't temporary either. The social structures that emerged during the bottleneck period became the foundation for later civilizations. The concept of royal bloodlines, the practice of polygamy among elites, the warrior aristocracy, all of these can trace their roots back to this period when most men's genetic lines were being wiped out. But here's what really drives the point home. We can see this pattern repeating in historical times. Genghis Khan and his descendants left such a massive genetic footprint that roughly 16 million men alive today carry his Y chromosome. That's just one example from recorded history. During the bottleneck period, this kind of extreme reproductive success was happening simultaneously across multiple continents. The transformation wasn't just about who got to reproduce, it fundamentally changed how human societies organized themselves, distributed resources, and passed down power. The hierarchical, patriarchal structures that dominated much of human civilization for millennia weren't inevitable. They were the direct result of this prehistoric genetic collapse. What makes this even more remarkable is that we can trace these social changes through multiple lines of evidence. The genetics, the archaeology, and the anthropological record all point to the same conclusion. The bottleneck didn't just eliminate genetic diversity, it created the template for complex, unequal societies that would define human civilization for thousands of years. The question that emerges from all this isn't just how these dramatic changes happened, but how scientists finally pieced together this incredible puzzle from fragments of ancient DNA and archaeological remains. When scientists first discovered the Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck, they faced a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. The genetic evidence was clear, but understanding what actually caused it, that was a completely different challenge. Here's the thing about science. Finding a pattern is just the beginning. You still need to prove what caused it, and proving something that happened 7,000 years ago isn't exactly straightforward. No witnesses, no written records, just DNA and whatever clues ancient bones could provide. The breakthrough came when geneticists decided to use computer simulations. Think of it like a massive video game, except instead of controlling characters, they were testing different scenarios that could explain the bottleneck. They fed in data about population sizes, migration patterns, and various catastrophic events to see what matched their genetic findings. First, they tested natural disasters, plagues, famines, volcanic eruptions, the works. But here's where things got interesting. Every natural catastrophe they simulated affected both men and women equally. If a disease wiped out 90% of the male genetic lines, it should have done the same to female lines. The mitochondrial DNA evidence clearly showed this didn't happen. Climate change scenarios failed too. Droughts and ice ages don't discriminate based on gender when it comes to survival. The simulations kept producing results that looked nothing like the actual genetic evidence. Then there's the population crash theory. Maybe entire groups of people just died out randomly. Well, that didn't work either. Random population bottlenecks create genetic patterns completely different from what scientists were seeing. The Neolithic bottleneck was too precise, too targeted. But when researchers programmed in warfare between patrilineal clans, something remarkable happened. The simulation results matched the genetic evidence almost perfectly. Wars between male-dominated family groups could explain why so many Y chromosome lines vanished while mitochondrial DNA remained diverse. Let's not forget the timing aspect. The computer model showed that this process would take exactly the right amount of time, around 2,000 years of intermittent conflict. Not constant warfare, but repeated cycles of violence and conquest spread across generations. Makes sense, right? Continuous total war would have wiped out everyone. The simulations revealed something else fascinating. In patrilineal societies where men stayed with their birth clans and women moved between groups, defeated clans would lose their male genetic lines entirely. But the women from those same clans would survive and reproduce within the victorious groups. This created the exact pattern scientists found in ancient DNA. Archaeological evidence started making more sense too. Those mass graves filled with young men, the fortified settlements, the sudden appearance of new burial practices in different regions, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion the genetic simulations had reached. And the weird part is how perfectly the puzzle pieces fit together. Anthropologists had already documented similar patterns in historical societies. When patrilineal warrior cultures clash repeatedly, you get exactly this kind of genetic outcome. A few dominant male lineages end up controlling vast territories and producing most of the next generation. The research teams didn't stop there, though. They tested hybrid scenarios. What if warfare combined with disease or climate change plus migration? None of these combinations improved the match between simulations and genetic data. Clan warfare alone explained the evidence better than any other factor. But why did this happen specifically during the Neolithic period? The simulations suggested it was connected to changes in how people lived. As farming communities grew larger and more settled, they accumulated more resources worth fighting over. Stone tools became more sophisticated. Population density increased, putting pressure on available land. The mathematical models showed that patrilineal clan systems become incredibly unstable under these conditions. Competition intensifies. Winners take everything, including the right to reproduce. Losers disappear from the genetic record entirely. What really convinced scientists was how well the simulation results matched genetic patterns from different continents. The same warfare-driven bottleneck appeared to have happened independently in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Different peoples, different environments, but similar social structures producing identical genetic outcomes. The evidence became overwhelming. No other explanation came close to matching what actually happened 7,000 years ago. Generations of brutal conflict between male-dominated clans had essentially created a prehistoric war of the Y chromosomes. Modern DNA analysis techniques kept improving the picture too. Researchers could track exactly which male lineages survived in which regions. They could see how victorious clans spread their genetic signatures across vast distances, replacing local Y chromosome diversity with their own limited patterns. This scientific detective work revealed something profound about human nature and social organization. When you combine patrilineal inheritance, territorial competition, and increasingly sophisticated weapons, you get one of the most dramatic genetic bottlenecks in human history. The mystery was solved, but its implications for understanding how ancient societies actually functioned were just beginning to unfold. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. Nearly 90% of all male genetic lines that existed before this catastrophe simply vanished, gone, erased from history as if they never existed at all. That's not a small dent in human diversity, that's a genetic massacre on a scale that boggles the mind. But here's what makes it even more incredible. Those missing bloodlines, they're still missing today. When scientists look at modern men's DNA across Europe, Asia, and Africa, they're essentially looking at the descendants of a tiny group of ancient winners. The genetic lottery was rigged, and most tickets were losers. Think about your own family tree for a second. Every single one of your male ancestors managed to survive this prehistoric gauntlet. Your great-great-great, at about 300 more greats, grandfather didn't just live through regular dangers like wild animals or diseases. He survived what was essentially a continent-spanning elimination tournament where the prize was getting to pass on his genes, and the penalty for losing was genetic extinction. The contrast with women's genetic diversity tells the whole story. While men's Y chromosomes show this dramatic bottleneck, like a river suddenly squeezed through a tiny pipe, women's mitochondrial DNA flows smoothly through the same time period. No massive die-offs, no sudden collapses, just business as usual on the maternal side, while the paternal side went through absolute chaos. Modern genetic studies reveal something fascinating about this divide. In many regions today, you can trace most men back to just one or two successful Y chromosome lineages that dominated their areas. It's like finding out that almost everyone in your neighborhood descended from the same great-great-grandfather, while their great-great-grandmothers came from dozens of different families. The Yamnaya culture provides a perfect example of how this played out. These ancient warriors swept across Europe around 5,000 years ago, and their genetic signature is everywhere in modern European men. One successful group's Y chromosomes spread like wildfire, while countless local male lineages disappeared forever. The archaeological evidence backs this up: mass graves, destroyed settlements, and clear signs of violent takeovers. Well, the implications go way beyond just genetics. This bottleneck fundamentally reshaped human society in ways we're still living with today. Those few surviving male lineages didn't just pass on their DNA, they passed on their social structures, their values, and their ways of organizing society. The extreme concentration of reproductive success among a small number of men created lasting patterns of inequality and hierarchy. When only a handful of males in each region successfully reproduced, it reinforced systems where power, resources, and mating opportunities flowed to the top. Many cultures today still show echoes of this ancient winner-take-all dynamic. But let's not overlook the women's side of this story. Their genetic diversity survived because they could move between groups and integrate into new societies even when their original clans were destroyed. This mobility meant that female genetic lines from losing groups didn't vanish, they just joined the winners. It's a survival strategy that worked remarkably well during humanity's most violent period. The timing of this bottleneck also reveals something important about human nature. This wasn't random violence or mindless aggression. It coincided perfectly with the rise of farming, permanent settlements, and growing populations. As resources became more valuable and territories more defined, the stakes of competition rose dramatically. Men organized into rival patrilineal clans and fought wars that could literally erase entire bloodlines from history. And here's the weird part. This pattern happened independently across multiple continents. Europe, Asia, and Africa all show the same genetic signature at roughly the same time. Human societies weren't coordinating these conflicts, but they were following similar paths toward extreme male competition and clan-based warfare. Scientists have run computer simulations trying to recreate this bottleneck, and only one scenario consistently produces the right genetic patterns. Repeated wars between patrilineal groups where losing men died but losing women survived and integrated with the winners. No other explanation, disease, natural disasters, or random population crashes can account for the sex-specific nature of this genetic collapse. The legacy lives on in our DNA today. When geneticists analyze modern populations, they're looking at the end result of this ancient filtering process. The successful Y chromosome lineages that survived those brutal millennia became the founding fathers of entire regions. Meanwhile, the mitochondrial DNA tells a much richer story of diverse female ancestry that weathered the storm. This prehistoric war of the Y chromosomes didn't just shape our genetics, it shaped our understanding of human history itself. The story buried in our DNA reveals truths about our ancestors that no written record could preserve. But what does this genetic detective story tell us about ourselves? The answer might be more relevant to modern life than you'd expect.